Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to Umlink Energy Speaks Back, powered by Heart. My name is Paul Webb. I'm the founder of B2B Energy, and I'm your host. Weekly, I present to you experts from around the world, and today I'm in Trinidad. Our purpose, as always, is to provide a good understanding of energy management knowledge from around the world, which is available today for us to deliver savings that impact on our planet. So before we get into our interview today, I would like to recognise our sponsors. They are Umlink, who are taking the confusion out of energy management, Clean Energy Revolution for their knowledge and networking in the renewable world, B2B Energy for their 11-week energy program, and driving down organisation's third largest expense, Hark Systems, renowned for their energy software, Alexis Energy for their power management initiatives, led by Vision for their LED and control systems, Watts for their electronics and EV transition program, Carbon Black Global for their waste to energy initiatives, and lastly, our certificate partners, Esther Energy. Welcome to episode 69 of Umlink Energy Speaks Back, powered by Hark. My special guest today is a published, highly capable and motivated petroleum expert with the passion to drive and introduce renewable energy and energy management into his country. So without any further ado, I give you Adrian Thomas. Adrian, good morning to you. And it's obviously good afternoon from us in the UK. So how are you today?
Morning, Paul. Morning. I'm pretty good. In a good mood today. I think I tend to really enjoy Christmas with family and friends. And I've been able to see my sister from the States, who I haven't seen in 2 years. And it's been, it's allowed me to take some time off and to just take the edge off of my usual hustle and bustle daily life.
Brilliant. And I can see the sun looks like it's trying to come through them curtains. Is that right? Is it hot today?
It is hot. The one thing I don't miss too much about the UK is the weather. In particular, where I was in Newcastle, the people were nice to me, but at some point I liked seeing the sun.
And you mentioned Newcastle. That is probably the coldest place in the UK to live. And someone from Trinidad, that I'm sure you got some stories there, haven't you?
Yeah. One of the funniest stories, I think, the first 2 weeks I was there, there's like a orientation type thing. There are events for new people coming on the program or in the campus. So I was doing a master's there, and these people come around to the dorm rooms, and we have events. And one of the events was, they're like, "Hi, Adrian," and these really bubbly undergrads, and they're like, "We're going to the beach. This is the beach in Newcastle." And they're like, "You want to come?" And I said, "No way." And they're like, "Why?" I said, "I'm from the Caribbean." All right. There's no comparison. There's no way that's better than what I've seen. But I eventually went to the beach in Aberdeen, and that was cold. It was just ridiculously cold.
Not the same sentence that you would have, no?
No. Eventually you warm up, but that was just cold, man. That Aberdeen beach was just freezing. I didn't enjoy it at all. All right. But being a Caribbean person, though, the beaches are something that we pride ourselves
in. Yeah. And how long was you in the UK for?
A little more than a year. I did my master's in Newcastle.
Right. So, Adrian, we've met on LinkedIn, and we've been sort of having a chat about what we both do in the energy sphere in both our countries. So tell us some background about yourself and what you're doing in your country.
Well, I consider myself working to become an energy specialist. I read somewhere that you always strive to be a specialist, and it's a continuous process. You don't ever really get there. But for me, I'm always into energy. And at a young age, I was lucky that I knew what I wanted to do. I was always into earth sciences. I always liked to go find fossils, whether they be ammonites or fossilized leaves, or I was always very interested in the dinosaurs when I was younger. For some reason, that always fascinated me. And I always liked geology and geography. And that led me to do those same things at school. And I excelled in it because I liked it. And that's something key that I think some of us don't get the opportunity to. So I was very lucky to do what I like. And that led me to do an undergrad in petroleum in geology. And from that experience, I was able to understand the energy industry. I was able to understand why we have oil and gas and why we need to move away from it, but some of the challenges that arise when we actually have to transition. The transition is not easy. I think some people think that it can be done quickly. It is actually very difficult to do it very, very quickly. But subsequent to that, I also realized that the need for sustainability in the energy mix. And that led me to do a master's at Newcastle University in renewable energy. And what that did for me, though, it opened my eyes again as to how this can be done. And I tell everyone that I meet that the energy transition is not an option. It's not an option. It's not a good idea. It's not something that we say, we can do this tomorrow. It has to be done. The challenge is how. And the challenge is not when, because when has to be now. The question is, how do we do it without negatively impacting financial or finances or the balance sheets, if you will, of some of these large companies who employ thousands of people. So in terms of background, I would say I'm an energy specialist, an energy professional, and someone who's trying to understand how we can work towards the energy transition globally. But I do operate and live in the Caribbean, in Trinidad and Tobago, and I've been able to get some projects under my belt in renewable energy over the past 8 years or so.
What sort of projects have they been? Can you give us some detail behind it?
Sure. So one thing that I did, I came back from the UK, came back to the Caribbean, and the interest in renewable energy was very, very slow, right? Even by global standards, we are still behind significantly as it pertains to implementation of renewable energy technology within the Caribbean. We do have some good forefront runners, like Barbados is quite progressive, and to a large extent also Jamaica. So what I did when I first came back, I got myself involved and I founded an NGO, and I focused on education. We focused on how to get people to understand what is energy management, what's the transition, why do we have to go green. And we were able to do projects in schools in Tobago. We were able to do projects in the interior in Guyana, where we were able to install a solar water pump for villages that live off grid, and to show them that they can actually have a certain level of a certain standard of living using solar, using alternative energy means. They don't have to have a generator making noise burning diesel. So we were able to do work also in Haiti. I was able to get involved in a project there to do design of systems, because in those countries, they have an unreliable grid, similar to Guyana to some extent, where they actually are able to augment their grid supply with renewables. So we were doing mostly renewable energy projects, some energy management, and we're looking to actually ramp up next year into doing bigger things.
You've been looking at generation, basically, and delivering generation in your country.
Yeah.
What about energy management? Are there organizations there focusing on how much energy they use and looking to save that? Is that on their radar?
Well, something that we do commercially, of course, are energy audits. And we're going to grow significantly in that space. To be honest, energy audits are not very popular in the Caribbean. Some companies have done it, in particular in some countries in the region. For example, Barbados has energy auditor companies. But in Trinidad and Tobago, in Guyana, and some areas that we focused in, it's not very common at all. Right. And although energy costs are very low in Trinidad, they're pretty high in Guyana. They're sort of average in Grenada, for example, but you don't get companies actually championing energy management, and that's something that we're looking to grow into.
Why aren't they popular?
I think it has to do with education. I could be wrong, but I think it has to do with if I tell someone, hey, I can reduce your energy cost by 10%, I think there's part of the sentiment is, well, I can just take off my lights more, use less of my AC. I don't really need a consultant for that. I think part of persons think that they can do it themselves, which may or may not be true. Some companies do quite a good job of energy management and conservation. They in fact do, and some of them don't. But I think part of it is similar to a financial audit, which was required because of what was happening with the economy in the US 100 years ago. Similar to that, energy is becoming a big thing. So much so that um, I saw job postings from Amazon in energy transition. I'm thinking to myself, why does Amazon want someone to work in that field? Energy is becoming a serious topic. As the population grows, as countries develop, they need energy. All right, a country can't go from um, underdeveloped to developed status without a regular and reliable supply of energy. They can't. So the idea of an energy audit will become, and we are working hard on that, something that's almost mandatory to manage energy. Just like any company has to do financial audits, any company commercially, we're working towards that, has to consider how they use energy. Because one thing that is not being talked about, we have oil and gas, we have renewable energies, solar, wind, and so on. One thing that's not being talked upon, we are being pushed for more and more and more energy. What we're trying to do is meet demand without impacting the environment negatively. But we need to understand that our demand for energy has to be curtailed somewhere.
Yeah.
We can't keep demanding more and more from the planet. We can't keep doing that. We can't keep saying, oh, well, we just put a solar farm in, put another wind farm in. But at some point, we have to say, how do we use less energy? How do we not do this? Because the earth can only give us so much. You understand?
We've seen significant growth, and specifically in the developing countries, but we are
Mhm.
seeing circa 4% energy growth across the globe
Yeah.
on a regular basis. And what with the developing countries as well, that's just going to expand further and further every year. And you're right
They
in what
need
you're
it.
saying. We've got to reduce it.
Yeah,
Energy
the other things.
energy management's got to come into this.
It is. And getting into it, but one of the biggest problems with that people don't talk about, for example, with nuclear energy, um, is that the biggest challenge it's not just the waste disposal. The biggest problem I think with renewable energy is that it actually works pretty well. Once there's no environmental impact, of course, but we have to move away from that. Nuclear energy does produce a lot of power. It actually does. But how do we find something similar to that without the harmful impacts on the environment? So we really have to think, what are we doing? We're just going to keep throwing more and more technologies behind energy, or are we going to say, well, how do we use less? How do we really use the minimal we can to get these our day-to-day lives going?
The split, the percentages at the moment regarding renewables and fossil fuels in your country currently?
Well, let's take it by the two countries I know most about. So in Trinidad, it's almost 99% fossil fuels.
Right.
Yeah, Trinidad and Tobago is a oil and gas exporting country. So similar to Kuwait and some countries in the Middle East, our CO2 output per capita is probably fifth in the world. So we are what we call energy hogs because we have a lot of cars on the road, we have a lot of heavy industries, we are oil and gas exporting country. Um, as it pertains to countries like Guyana, it's still mostly diesel. They still mostly use probably more than 70%. It's still hydrocarbon based. And across the Caribbean region, that's more or less very similar. We're still heavily dependent upon fossil fuels for our power generation.
And presumably because you've got an abundance of gas and oil, your
Yeah,
energy prices are low
very
compared
low.
to
Very low. Well, at
Yeah,
least in Trinidad. So Guyana's pretty high, but that may change in about 5 years because they found significant hydrocarbon resources
right.
within the last 6 years or so. Um, some of the other islands within the Caribbean don't have hydrocarbons, but their costs are a bit a bit high. I would say above average, if you will. Could be about 18 to 22 cents per kilowatt hour.
Challenge do you have in your country? Are you one of many, or there's not so many of you energy specialists there?
There are not many, but it's growing. I would say within the last 2 years, I've seen an uptick in people talking about renewables and more so energy management. So I would say when I did my funny story, when I did my master's, one of someone I knew, I wouldn't say he's a mentor, he's a little older than I am. He worked at BP and he's telling me, why are you doing that? Renewable energy will only have a ceiling. It will never replace oil and gas. There's no point for you to leave the industry or do something else. In 2020, he was let go, and he's now actually unemployed since last year. So part of it is to understand trends, and any entrepreneur, and he needs to have that gift of seeing what is, but also seeing what will be in the next 5 to 10 years. And I knew that renewable energy will have to have a bigger share of the pie within 10 years' time, within 5 years' time. And that's why I did it. So these are the things that are important that you're able to understand where the economy is going and where the opportunities are there as an entrepreneur.
What are there many big commercial businesses in your country that should be looking at this that are global, maybe?
Hmm. Well, in terms of renewable energy, then a lot of there are a couple of small companies, nothing massive. And that's because, so for example, in Trinidad, grid tied solar is not allowed. It's not legally allowed as yet for you to grid tie your solar system to the grid.
Right.
And that legislation has been talked about for about 8 years with very small, I would say, jumps, if you will, in it being enacted. So we do have legally, we still have huge boundaries in actually uptaking solar or even uptaking any other forms of renewable energy. So
So
we have
just go back on that a second. So you can have solar on your roof, but you can't connect it back into the grid. Is that what you're
you
saying?
can't. So you can only do off-grid solar if
Right.
you wish.
Right.
No grid tied solar is allowed. You can apply for it, but that can be a lengthy process, and most
Yeah.
times the answer is no.
And is that because of restrictions on the grid, sort of infrastructure problems, or
Um,
is that what they tell you?
I think it's a matter of both, right?
Yeah.
I think we do have a situation where we have a fair amount of generation already from our gas powered systems, natural gas powered systems. We don't have an energy shortage in Trinidad,
Yeah.
where we have an energy surplus. Excess power on the grid, it may not be attractive for the local utility. But I do believe that they will do it. It's a matter of when. It could be next 2 years, next 3 years. That's one of the reasons why I focused heavily in Guyana for my actual company and for growing that business, because there was no real demand or support for the business in Trinidad.
And you've got staff there, haven't you, that you're developing?
Yes, so we're developing staff. We have guys, about 8 guys who are with us. We've partnered with to do renewables and as well as energy management. We actually had a meeting this morning, and we're looking to see how we can really create a strong energy management company focusing on energy conservation and renewables and energy efficiency within the Guyana space.
And what do you think your challenges are regarding that? What sort of things you're going to need?
The changes to get it done, you mean?
The challenges regarding
Or
what's ahead
challenges?
of you, people, technologies.
Well, as it pertains to the energy management, one of the biggest challenges would be education, right? People don't have the understanding that we need to conserve energy. It still is not something that is fashionable. I would say installing solar panels is much more fashionable in the Caribbean region than approaching a company and saying, we can reduce your energy consumption. I think people understand, oh, solar can generate power for me and get me off the grid. But to understand first that we need to reduce energy consumption requires, I think, a little bit of conditioning and explanation. So we approach companies and we have to go through a process where we explain what we're trying to achieve.
Then we've just said COP26.
Yep.
Was your country
Yeah.
engaged with that?
Yeah.
Big smile. You're gonna have to explain the smile, Adrian, on your face.
Well, if you have time to do the research, of course it's Trinidad and Tobago, but we still talk about the Caribbean region.
Yeah.
The Prime Minister of Barbados gave what some might say would have been, I don't want to use the word legendary, but a very rousing speech about it, about climate change. If you have time, you can check it out. Her name is Mia Motley. And what she discussed was Barbados is a fairly flat country.
Right.
It's a pretty small island, limestone-based flat country, and they are actually one of those countries that can be significantly impacted upon by rising sea levels. And they have been doing a lot within their space to promote renewable energy. Barbados is probably the leader in the Caribbean as it pertains to renewable energy and installations. But their point is they can do 1,000 great things, but if the world doesn't work with them, they're still going to be in trouble. Exactly. It doesn't matter.
We've all got to work on it together.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's not the people that are causing the problem that's going to be impacted the most.
That's a problem. Yeah.
We'll all eventually be impacted, if we don't do anything. But initially, the impact on the country is going to be on the world is going to be in the areas which they're not impacting on it, which is very sad in my eyes. So
it's almost like a reverse. Who feels it first and most will be the small developing islands or countries, these island states. They're going to feel it first. And people living in large continents, US, Canada, China, and so on, they will feel it. They will probably feel effective at last. So we in the Caribbean have to be mindful that we have a job to do, but we also need a large amount of support from our brothers and sisters in these developed countries to help us to maintain our quality of life.
And this is one of the reasons why this podcast is out there, is to bring your story to the rest of the world and for you to learn the stories from the rest of the world as well. Because, we've been talking, there's my training, there's my support I can give you, there's documentation that can help you with the awareness of your country.
Yes.
I'm lucky in the UK because we've had legislation and I've been in this industry for 40 years, but every year goes past, there's a little tweak regarding legislation that then brings, it means I've got to sometimes do more training, but then it's another driver. If I looked at the drivers, say 10 years ago, it would be save money and possibly climate change, the ozone layer. Right. Now it's the ozone layer, it's climate change, it's, driving our costs down in energy crisis, the prices going up of energy. There's more driving for it. And legislation, we have things like ESOS. So it's all the major organizations have to focus on that, and SECRA. Unfortunately, the little companies, they need some support. So I've been lucky. So that's why I'm bringing this story and sharing these stories around the world through this podcast.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I think these are the things that make a lot of sense if you have linkages between companies and countries and different experiences. So one thing you mentioned there about legislations, that actually is a big difference. That actually works, and it works pretty well globally. So the government have to support the initiative and put those laws in place, those rules in place to support the actual economy and to support the actual private sector in companies from getting involved in it. So at the end of the day, as I have a class and I tell everyone, yes, we talk about going green and sustainability, but we can't sustain something indefinitely if it doesn't have some break even or profit in the end, because we just can't do it. There's no way you can support an initiative indefinitely without it being sustainable. Right? And most times, if it's private sector, it has to be sustainable financially. That's a requirement. And the government can play a key role in that, actually. They, in fact, can.
We talked about offline, which is totally irrelevant to what we're talking about now. But we're talking about governments and legislation and laws. We're talking about masks. And we're talking about people being told to wear a mask. And they do.
Yeah.
If it's a legislation and they get told it's a rule.
Yeah.
Why can't it be a rule to turn your lights off? Why can't it be a rule to only use your air conditioning at certain values? That's what's going to happen. Long term, that will happen. We have no choice.
Yes, exactly. I think long term, for us to really cut back on energy usage, we will have to get to a point where we have laws in place as to how we use or abuse energy. Technically, in Trinidad, we abuse energy significantly because it's cheap and our bottom line is not heavily impacted on it or by it. But if it was, and if there was some fine to pay and so on, people will fall in line. People will say, okay, I need to monitor my AC usage. I need to monitor my light usage. I need to monitor how I even burn gas or fuel because it's all the same in climate, right? It's still impacted upon by how we use gasoline. So you're totally correct there. Mandates, or I shouldn't say mandates, but legislation that promotes energy management, that promotes green living and green lifestyle is in fact critical to the growth of the actual sector within the Caribbean region.
So, Adrian, we've had a rehearsal on this because we had problems with the noise and broadband. So you know where we are in the point of my podcast at the moment is I like to put my guest on the spot, and you've been on the spot ever since we started, obviously. But is there anything you can give back to the industry today from your country and from you individually?
Well, I'll take it in two parts. The first thing we can give back is the drive to reduce energy usage and to also embrace renewable energies is one that we have to do. It's not a good idea. It's not a novelty that we could do once. It has to be something that becomes standard to how we live. And secondly, what I would say is, as I mentioned prior, is if you're an entrepreneur, if there's something that you would really love to do, something that you've been thinking about, whether it be renewable energy, whether it be a chef, whether it be a DJ in a booth, right? You have to bet on yourself, bank on yourself, and believe in yourself, because if you don't, no one else will. And being an entrepreneur or being someone who works in that industry, you have to be able to say, I know I can do it. I know I can succeed, and I have the passion and the energy to get it done. I think one of the worst things that we can do to ourselves is to have a dream and just let it die and don't believe in ourselves. Because having support from a friend or family is good, but when it's all said and done, you have to believe in yourself to achieve any goal that you're trying to achieve, especially one that's not common or one that you didn't set out to do initially. So you need to have that belief, that passion, that drive, and that energy, and you can get the things you want in life or out of life. It really is attainable.
I agree. And I didn't say that when I started out 40 years ago, and that's what I'm going to be. But every year that passed through the industry and every transition, I've gone through transition. You mentioned nuclear fuel, nuclear power. That was my first beginning. I've been in energy management. I've been in controls, and each sort of milestone of my career, I've had to think exactly that thing, and set my goals, set my mind. And in fact, we're coming up to now. By the time this podcast goes out, we'll be in 2022. So it's now we need to start looking at setting our goals, and we could be setting our goals in January. It doesn't matter as long as we set them goals, and set them goals out there to pass. We don't have to set them out for 40 years. I didn't, but I'm still here.
Right.
So Adrian,
that's important. Yeah.
It's been really great catching up with you again.
Same here. Same.
Apologies for the mix up with all the broadband and the communications, but we've got there in the end. It's really great hearing from you. I hope that we can get you back and hear some more involvement, what's happening in your country in the future. So you and your family, please stay safe in these times.
Same to you, Paul. I mean, it's a difficult time still globally. I don't think we thought you'd still be here basically 2 years in, but keep safe.
Thank you.